The courtroom laughed when she said, "I'm my mom's lawyer," but minutes later, everyone was silent. The courtroom hummed with impatience. Shoes scuffed marble, papers whispered. Adults spoke in clipped, confident tones, except for one quiet figure in the second row. Aaliyah sat straight-backed, her feet not touching the floor. Her braids were neatly tied with blue ribbons, and her hands rested on a manila folder that looked far too big for her lap. When the clerk called the case, State versus Renee Carter, Aaliyah stood up, gasps rippled. The judge peered over his glasses. "Young lady, where is your attorney?" Aaliyah lifted her chin. "I'm my mom's lawyer." A few people laughed. The bailiff shifted. The judge sighed until he noticed the seriousness in her eyes. "Sit down," the judge said gently. "We'll find you proper representation." Aaliyah didn't move. "Please, Your Honor, just let me speak." The room went still. Renee Carter stood at the defense table like someone bracing against a storm no one else could feel. Her wrists trembled, not from guilt, but from exhaustion, the kind that sinks into bones after years of choosing between rent and groceries, between sleep and survival. She kept her hands clasped together because if she didn't, she feared they might betray her, shake too visibly, reveal too much. The courtroom was colder than it needed to be. The charge sounded simple when spoken aloud: neglect. But the truth behind it was heavy. Renee worked a night shift at a nursing home, double shifts when she could get them, extra hours when someone else called in sick. On the night in question, her babysitter had cancelled. She had begged her supervisor for time off. He had said no. "If you don't come in," he'd told her, not unkindly, "don't come back." So she had done what many mothers had done before her. She tucked her daughter into bed, left food on the counter, locked the door, and prayed nothing would go wrong. A neighbor had noticed the lights, the silence, the hours. A call was made. Forms were filled out. And paperwork, cold, efficient, unforgiving, turned a struggling mother into a defendant. Renee had requested a public defender. One never came. The judge adjusted his glasses and scanned the file again, his expression neutral in the way only practiced authority can be. "Ms. Carter," he said, "you stand accused of knowingly leaving your minor child unattended. Do you understand the seriousness of these charges?" Renee nodded, her throat tight. "Yes, Your Honor." Her eyes flicked once to the first row of the gallery. Aaliyah sat there, feet dangling above the floor, legs too short for the bench. Her hands were folded in her lap, just like her mother. She had chosen the yellow dress, the one her mother liked best. She had watched her mother cry into a pillow that morning. Not loud sobs. The quiet kind. The kind adults think children don't notice. But Aaliyah noticed everything. She remembered the nights her mother came home smelling of antiseptic and tiredness, the way Renee's hands shook when she counted change, the way she still smiled, always smiled, when Aaliyah showed her a drawing or read a sentence out loud. Aaliyah had listened, and she had remembered. The prosecutor stood and spoke in clean, sharp sentences. Words like reckless, words like endangerment, words that sounded bigger than the life they described. When he finished, the courtroom went still. The judge looked toward the defense table. "Ms. Carter," he said slowly, "you have no legal representation present. Is that correct?" Renee swallowed. "Yes, sir." A pause. Then, unexpected. From the gallery, Aaliyah stood up. The bailiff moved instinctively, but the judge raised a hand. The child's voice was small but steady. "I can help." A murmur rippled through the room. The judge leaned forward. "And who are you, young lady?" "Aaliyah Carter," she said. "That's my mom." The judge's brow furrowed, not unkindly. "You understand this is a courtroom?" Aaliyah nodded. "Yes, sir." "Why do you think you can represent your mother?" Renee turned, eyes wide with panic. "Aaliyah, baby." But Aaliyah was already walking forward, clutching a worn blue folder to her chest like a shield. She stopped beside her mother. She opened the folder. Inside were drawings, crayon sketches of their apartment, labeled carefully, kitchen, bed, door locked. Notes in careful, uneven handwriting. Copies of letters her mother had written to her job, to social services, to anyone who might listen. Aaliyah looked up. "Because I know the truth," she said. Her voice wavered just once. "And I wrote it down." She began to read. She read about nights alone that weren't scary, because Mom always called on break. She read about food left ready. About rules written on sticky notes: don't open the door, call Grandma if scared. She read a letter Renee had written but never sent, apologizing to her daughter for being tired all the time. The courtroom was silent. No coughing. No shuffling. Even the prosecutor had stopped taking notes. Aaliyah finished and looked up again. "My mom didn't leave me," she said softly. "She was taking care of me even when she wasn't there." Renee was crying openly now. Not from fear, from being seen. The judge removed his glasses. For the first time since the hearing began, his voice wasn't formal. "Thank you, Aaliyah," he said. "You may sit down." But everyone knew something had already changed. This wasn't just a case anymore. It was a truth spoken clearly by the smallest voice in the room. And the court had no choice but to listen. Aaliyah walked to the podium slowly, the sound of her shoes echoing louder than they should have in the quiet courtroom. The microphone hovered above her head, just out of reach. She stood on her toes, adjusted it with both hands, and took a breath she had practiced at home. "My mom works at Mercy Laundry," she began. Her voice was small, but it didn't break. "She cleans hospital sheets, the ones with blood on them, the ones sick people use. She washes them so doctors don't get sick too." A murmur passed through the gallery. "She works nights because they pay more," Aaliyah continued. "Not because she wants to, because rent costs more." The prosecutor shifted in his seat. "She left me with Mrs. Alvarez like she always does." The prosecutor stood. "Objection, Your Honor. The report clearly states the child was found alone." The judge raised a hand. "Let her finish." Aaliyah nodded politely, the way her mother had taught her, then flipped open the folder again. Her fingers were steady now. "Mrs. Alvarez wrote this letter," she said, holding up a folded page. "She watches me after school and at night. She was sick that night. She told my mom late. My mom didn't know before work." The prosecutor frowned. "There's no official record of that." Aaliyah looked at him, confused but respectful. "She doesn't have a computer," she said. "She writes letters." A few people in the room shifted uncomfortably. "My mom tried to find someone else," Aaliyah went on. "She didn't stop trying." She held up a sheet of paper. "I wrote down the times." The page was filled with neat columns drawn in pencil, names on the left, times on the right, some crossed out, some circled. Grandma, 7:12 p.m., no answer. Aunt Denise, 7:19 p.m., at work. Mrs. Hill, 7:26 p.m., voicemail. Mr. Thomas, 7:34 p.m., said no. Mrs. Alvarez, 8:01 p.m., sick. "I learned how to tell time last year," Aaliyah added quietly. "My mom was proud." The judge leaned forward, his elbows resting on the bench. "You recorded these as the calls were made?" he asked. "Yes, sir," Aaliyah said. "I was sitting at the table doing homework." Renee closed her eyes. Aaliyah flipped another page. "And this," she said, lifting a crayon drawing, "is my calendar." The paper showed a week in bright colors, school days marked with books, weekends with stars, nights with a moon symbol. "My mom never leaves me alone on school nights," Aaliyah said. "Never. If she has to work late, she takes off the next morning so she can walk me to school." She pointed to a square on the calendar. That night wasn't a school night. The prosecutor opened his mouth, then closed it again. Aaliyah wasn't finished. She reached into the folder and pulled out a small, folded note. The paper was creased and worn, like it had been opened many times. "This is what my mom left me," she said. She unfolded it carefully and read. "Aaliyah, I'll be back before you wake up. There's food in the fridge. Lock the door. Call me if you're scared. I love you more than anything." Her voice wobbled just slightly. "But I wasn't scared," she added, "because she always comes back." Silence filled the room, not the awkward kind, the heavy kind. The judge removed his glasses again. "Ms. Carter," he said, looking at Renee, "did you document your attempts to find childcare?" Renee stood, hands shaking. "I didn't know I needed to," she said. "I didn't think I'd ever have to prove I loved my child." The judge nodded slowly. The prosecutor cleared his throat. "Your Honor, intent does not erase risk." Aaliyah looked up again. "My mom teaches me about risk," she said. "She teaches me how to be careful, how to lock doors, how to call for help. She says being poor doesn't mean being careless." No one laughed. Not even a little. The judge glanced at the social worker seated near the aisle. "Did you interview the child?" he asked. The woman hesitated, briefly. Aaliyah tilted her head. "She asked me if I was scared," she said. "I said no." She wrote, "Child appeared quiet." The judge's jaw tightened. "Thank you, Aaliyah," he said softly. "You may return to your seat." Aaliyah gathered her papers, slid them back into the folder, and walked back to her mother. Renee pulled her close, pressing her forehead to her daughter's hair. For the first time since the case had begun, the prosecutor sat down without speaking. The judge looked around the courtroom. "The court will take a brief recess," he announced. As the gavel struck, something was clear to everyone present. This was no longer a story of neglect. It was a record written in pencil, crayon, and truth. And it was stronger than anyone had expected. Aaliyah took a breath. It was the kind of breath she took before school presentations, the kind her mother had taught her to take when fear tried to sit on her chest. "Slow in, slower out. There's more," she said, her voice small but steady, echoing across the courtroom that suddenly felt too big for a girl her age. Every eye turned toward her, not with the distant curiosity from earlier, but with something sharper now, attention. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a folded envelope, its edges worn, as if it had been opened and closed 100 times. "This is from my teacher," Aaliyah continued. "She knows my mom brings me breakfast every morning, even when she hasn't slept." Her fingers tightened around the paper as if letting go might make the words disappear. The judge leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable, and nodded to the clerk. The clerk approached gently, like one might approach a skittish animal, and accepted the envelope with both hands. The sound of paper unfolding seemed loud in the silence. Aaliyah swallowed. Her voice trembled now, a crack running through it, but she did not stop. "My teacher wrote that my mom stays at the school gate until the bell rings. She said my mom always asks if I ate enough. She said she's never seen my mom miss a day." A few people shifted in their seats. Somewhere behind Aaliyah, her mother's breath caught, sharp and involuntary. The judge skimmed the letter, his brow tightening, then passed it to the opposing counsel, whose confident posture from earlier had begun to sag. Aaliyah looked straight ahead. "The report says my mom is careless," she said, each word carefully placed, as if she were afraid they might fall apart. "But the neighbor who called it in," she stopped. The courtroom waited. Even the clock on the wall seemed to pause. "He asked my mom for money to watch me after she said no." The words landed like glass breaking. A murmur erupted instantly, spreading across the benches in a wave, whispers, gasps, sharp intakes of breath. The judge struck his gavel once, firm but controlled, restoring order, though the air still vibrated with shock. Aaliyah's hands were shaking now. She pressed them together, remembering her mother's voice telling her she was brave, reminding her that the truth mattered even when it scared you. "I wrote what he said," Aaliyah added softly, "and when—" She reached into her backpack again and pulled out a small notebook, its cover creased, the corners rounded from use. She held it up not dramatically, just honestly, like proof that existed whether anyone wanted it to or not. "I write things down when they feel wrong," she said. "My mom told me to." The clerk took the notebook. The pages were filled with careful handwriting, dates neatly aligned, times written in the margins. The courtroom held its breath as the judge flipped through, page by page, his face growing more severe with each line. The opposing attorney opened his mouth, then closed it again. Across the aisle, the neighbor sat rigid, his jaw clenched, eyes fixed on the floor. For the first time since the hearing began, he looked small. The judge cleared his throat. "This notebook details repeated contact," he said slowly, deliberately. "Requests for money, language that is inappropriate, and a clear timeline." Up at Aaliyah. "Did anyone help you write this?" Aaliyah shook her head. "No, sir, I just wrote what I heard." The judge nodded once, then turned to the social worker whose report had started this case. "Did you investigate the source of the complaint?" The social worker hesitated. We followed protocol," she said, but the confidence was gone. "Did you speak to the child's teacher?" the judge asked. Silence. "Did you verify the neighbor's claims with any independent sources?" Silence again. The murmurs returned, louder this time, edged with anger. Aaliyah stood there, heart pounding, feeling suddenly very tired, but also lighter, as if a heavy door she'd been pushing against had finally begun to move. Her mother's eyes were wet, her hands shaking in her lap, pride and fear tangled together. The judge set the notebook down carefully, as if it was something fragile and important. "This court takes false reports and coercion very seriously," he said. He looked directly at Aaliyah. "You were very brave to speak today." Aaliyah nodded, not trusting her voice anymore. She had said what she needed to say. The truth was no longer just hers to carry. The judge raised a hand, and the sound never came, yet silence fell so completely it felt physical, like a blanket laid over the room. Conversations died mid-breath. Papers stopped rustling. Even the restless benches went still. The judge lowered his gaze to the documents before him, not hurried now, not distracted. He read with care, with weight, as if every word carried a consequence that demanded respect. He reviewed the letters again, slower this time. The teacher's note, the attendance records. Breakfast routine written not as sentiment but as fact. Then the call log, dates and times aligned with a precision that left little room for doubt. Finally, he picked up the drawing. What some had dismissed earlier as a child's scribble was now unmistakable. It was not art for art's sake. It was memory made visible, a timeline disguised in color, stick figures marked with initials, arrows pointing to days, small notes written in the careful handwriting of a child who knew she needed to be exact. The judge leaned back, exhaling through his nose. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different tone, one stripped of formality and edged with conviction. "Ms. Carter," he said at last, looking directly at Renee, "this court finds no evidence of neglect." The words seemed to echo, bouncing off the walls, settling into corners that had been heavy with fear only moments before. Renee's knees buckled, as if the floor had suddenly shifted beneath her. She reached for the table, then for her mouth, pressing her hand there to hold in a sob that broke free anyway. Tears streamed down her face, unrestrained now, years of exhaustion and worry pouring out in a single breath. She had prepared herself for the worst. She had rehearsed explanations in her head during sleepless nights. She had imagined walking out of this room empty-handed. Instead, the truth had carried her here. The judge waited, allowing the moment its space, then turned his attention back to Aaliyah. His expression softened, the stern lines around his eyes easing. "Young lady," he said, "you did remarkable work." Aaliyah felt her chest tighten, not with fear this time, but with something warmer, something unfamiliar. She nodded once, small and composed, just as her mother had taught her. "I just told the truth," she said. There was no pride in her voice, no attempt at heroics, just honesty. The judge nodded, as if that answer was exactly what he had expected. He lifted the gavel, holding it for a heartbeat longer than necessary, letting the weight of the decision settle into the room. Then it struck. The sharp sound rang out, clean and final. Case dismissed. For a moment, no one moved. Then the tension broke. A breath passed through the courtroom like a wave. Renee pulled Aaliyah into her arms, holding her tightly, her shoulders shaking as she whispered thank yous that blurred together. Across the room, the neighbor's face had drained of color, his certainty replaced with panic as the judge's final words lingered like a warning. The social worker stared down at her notes, avoiding eye contact, her assumptions laid bare. As mother and daughter stood together, hand in hand, the courtroom no longer felt like a place of judgment. It felt like a place where truth had been heard and listened to. Outside the courthouse, the doors swung open and the noise rushed in like a tide. Reporters crowded the steps, microphones lifting, cameras flashing, voices overlapping in a jumble of questions and commentary. The air smelled of rain and concrete and something electric, possibility. Aaliyah blinked against the sudden brightness, her hand still wrapped tightly in her mother, as if letting go might undo everything that had just happened. Renee stood taller now, shoulders no longer curved inward by fear, her face tired but radiant, the kind of exhaustion that comes after surviving something heavy. A reporter leaned forward, crouching slightly to meet Aaliyah's height, his tone softening. "Do you want to be a lawyer when you grow up?" he asked, half smiling, as if expecting a cute answer, a childish dream that would make a good closing clip. Aaliyah didn't answer right away. She looked up at her mom, squeezing her hand once, feeling the familiar warmth and reassurance there. Then she turned back to the reporter, her chin lifting just a little. "Yes," she said clearly, "because sometimes the truth needs help standing up." The words traveled fast. Pens paused mid-scratch. A camera lens zoomed in. For a second, even the reporters forgot to shout. Renee dropped to her knees then, right there on the courthouse steps, and wrapped Aaliyah in her arms, holding her tightly as if anchoring the moment in her body so she would never forget it. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered, her voice thick, the sentence breaking apart as tears spilled freely. Aaliyah hugged back just as hard, her face pressed into her mother's shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent that meant home and safety, and late nights turned into early mornings. They didn't stay long. The noise was too much, the attention overwhelming. They slipped away together, walking down the steps hand in hand, past strangers who smiled at them with a softness that felt new. In the weeks that followed, life didn't suddenly become perfect. Renee still worked long hours, bills still arrived, mornings were still rushed, but something fundamental had shifted. Fear no longer sat at the kitchen table with them. Aaliyah kept writing, filling notebooks with observations, questions, small moments that felt important. Renee never told her to stop. Years passed quietly, steadily. Aaliyah grew taller. The notebooks multiplied. School essays turned into debate competitions. Questions turned into arguments backed by evidence. When she stood at podiums, she stood straight, her voice calm, her hands steady, as if the courtroom had taught her something permanent about who she was. Renee attended every event she could, sitting in the front row whenever possible, watching her daughter with the same mixture of awe and gratitude she had felt that day in court. And then one afternoon, many years later, sunlight streamed through the windows of a modest law office downtown. On the wall behind a polished desk hung a framed photograph. It showed a little girl with blue ribbons in her hair, standing at a podium far too big for her, her face serious, her eyes unafraid. Clients sometimes noticed it and asked about it. The woman behind the desk would smile just a little and say, "That was the moment I learned the truth matters." The photo didn't just capture a child, it captured a beginning, a reminder that justice doesn't always arrive loud or powerful or grown. Sometimes it comes small, written carefully in ink, carried by a voice that refuses to stay silent, and a world brave enough at last to listen.